This is chapter 8 of Pasquala. It's called Visitors. When one summer had passed, a messenger from our people came to Mission Santa Ynez to speak to my father. He had been seen by the chief and the elders of our tribe. The messenger told my father that the people of our tribe were not happy that we were living at the mission. They wanted us to return to the valley of the Tules. These words disturbed my father, but we did not leave the mission. Messengers came to the mission whenever the Yokuts traveled through the mountain passes on the way to the Great Blue Ocean. After a time, the messengers no longer came. I wondered if our people still kept us in their hearts. By the end, by the time I was 12 summers old, my mother had taught me to weave. Now, instead of spinning wool with a drop spindle, I worked at a large loom like my mother. With a wooden shuttle, I wove long strands of yarn back and forth across the loom to make wide pieces of cloth. At the end of the day, I piled the pieces of cloth I had woven near the doorway of the workshop. Another neophyte would take the cloth to the sewing room where clothing was made for the people at the mission. Each day, as we worked, the padre brought us a clay jar of cool water. One day, the padre asked us to share the water with the workers in the leather shop where my father made saddles. Mother and I left our weaving and started down the corridor. When we reached the far side of the corridor near the leather shop, we saw my father talking with two soldados. The soldados were looking at a beautiful leather saddle that my father was finishing. As my mother and I moved closer, I could see my father's hands slowly tooling a design on the sides of the saddle horn. How carefully my father moved the blade into the soft material, pushing the leather into beautiful curves and shapes. The leaf like designs reminded me of grapevines that grew in the mission vineyards. As the soldados watched my father tooling the design on the saddle, I heard them say that they had come from the Presidio in Santa Barbara. One soldado began to move about the workshop, talking to the neophytes as they worked. The other soldado leaned heavily against my father's workbench. Each time he tried to talk, he coughed. When he saw the water jar that my mother and I had brought, he pushed the wide-brimmed black hat he wore back from his face and motioned for me to bring him a cup of water. As he drank the water, I noticed how tired he looked. Waiting for him to finish, I looked at him carefully. Over a long sleeved shirt, he wore a cuera, a vest made of many layers of leather, and a shoulder belt that held bullets. There were burrs and dried leaves clinging to his dark wool pants. When the soldado stepped from behind the workbench to fill his cup again, I saw his high leather boots and heard the jangle of the large spiked rowels on his spurs. Finishing his drink, he passed the cup back to me, and I refilled the cup for my father. While my mother and I were passing the cool water to the other neophytes in the workshop, the padre appeared. After talking with the soldados, he told my father and the other workers that the soldados at the Presidio needed saddles. The padre wanted my father and the others to go with the soldados to Santa Barbara to deliver the leather goods. The next morning, I watched my father harness a mule to a carreta, a small cart, and load the carreta with saddles. He covered the saddles with a heavy wool blanket to protect them from the dust and hot sun. Driving the carreta, father followed the soldados on their horses through the mission gates. Four neophytes from the mission joined the group as they started down the long trail to Santa Barbara. I waved to my father until I could only see puffs of dust in the far distance. I knew my father would not return for many days, and I would miss him. During the time my father was away, my mother and I continued our daily work. The days seemed longer with my father gone. Each morning before I went to the workshop, I stood at the mission gates looking down the trail, hoping to see the men return. I could hardly wait to see my father and hear the story he would tell about his trip to Santa Barbara. One morning, as I stood at the mission gates, I heard people shouting from one of the storehouses. As I ran back to the mission courtyard, the padre raced past me, pulling his gray robes up to his knees so he could run faster. Right behind him came four angry cooks waving large spoons and knives in the air. They yelled that a black bear was in the storehouse. I followed the padre and the cooks, hoping to see the bear. When we reached the storehouse, we saw that the doors had been smashed open. Large sacks of dried apples and apricots and a barrel of corn had been pulled outside and left open. A trail of dried beef led us down the hillside to the place where hundreds of red ladrillos, floor tiles, were drying in the sun. The padre pointed to the several wet tiles with the large bear paw prints in them. Everyone stopped running and looked at each other. We could see the bear's trails leading into a grove of trees. No one wanted to follow the bear into the forest. Laughing